For centuries, the City of London has stood as the beating heart of Britain's economic and commercial power. Even today, global giants place their headquarters in its financial districts. But none of these modern corporations, neither the oil conglomerates nor the tech titans, can match the influence and dominance of a company founded more than 400 years ago. A company so powerful that it did not merely trade across continents, it conquered them. That company was the East India Company. From its headquarters on Leadenhall Street, the East India Company rose from modest origins as a trading venture into an organization that effectively ruled the Indian subcontinent. At its height, this private corporation commanded a larger army than most European nations, generated unimaginable wealth, and dictated the fate of kingdoms thousands of miles away. Kings negotiated with it. Empires feared it. Shareholders grew rich beyond belief. And millions of people fell under its political, economic, and military authority. But how did a business, founded by merchants and investors, become one of the greatest imperial forces the world had ever seen? The story begins at the turn of the 17th century, during a time when Spain and Portugal dominated global exploration. Their fleets had carved out vast overseas empires, funneling gold, spices, and treasures back to Europe. Inspired by these riches, other European powers, especially England, France, and the Dutch Republic, sought to join in. But colonial expeditions were expensive and risky. Governments alone could not finance them. Thus emerged one of the most revolutionary ideas in economic history: the joint stock company. By allowing ordinary citizens, merchants, and nobles to invest money in long-distance expeditions, the financial burden could be shared. In return, investors received a portion of whatever profits the voyages returned. It was the birth of the modern corporation. England's first experiment with this model came in 1555 with the Muscovy Company, which established trade with Russia. But merchants in London soon realized that the real wealth of the world lay further east, in India, China, and the spice-rich islands of Southeast Asia. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, silk, porcelain, and tea were worth more than gold in European markets. Whoever controlled these goods controlled a global empire. So, in 1600, a group of influential London merchants petitioned Queen Elizabeth I for a royal charter. She agreed, granting official permission for the formation of the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. This was the formal birth of the East India Company. The company's early years were difficult. Their voyages to the East Indies, today's Malaysia and Indonesia, ran into fierce competition from the well-established Dutch East India Company and the Portuguese. But by the 1610s, English traders found better opportunities in India. Local rulers along the coast granted permission for trade, allowing the company to establish factories, essentially fortified trading posts. A major turning point came in 1639, when the company acquired land on India's southeastern coast and built the settlement of Madras. This became one of its first true colonial footholds. A second boost arrived in 1661, when the Portuguese handed over the island of Bombay to England as part of a royal marriage alliance. The company quickly established itself there as well. By the late 17th century, the East India Company controlled several important coastal bases, but its ambitions were expanding far beyond trade. While the company's activities in Asia grew, it also became entangled in the African slave trade. To avoid conflict with the Royal African Company, which dominated West Africa, the East India Company focused on East Africa. Slaves from Mozambique and Madagascar were transported across the Indian Ocean to work in company workshops and factories in India and the East Indies. These practices boosted profits for shareholders in London, even as the human cost was devastating. Meanwhile, competition with the Dutch intensified. The Anglo-Dutch wars of the 17th century were largely fought over trade dominance. For decades, the Dutch overshadowed the English in the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. But the 18th century would change everything. The key figure in this transformation was a young clerk turned soldier named Robert Clive. Clive joined the East India Company at 20. By the early 1550s, he had become a leading military strategist in India. At this time, the company's private army, composed of British soldiers and large numbers of Indian sepoys, had grown to thousands of men. This force allowed the company to intervene in the political struggles of India's regional rulers. In 1757, Clive launched the campaign that would alter the course of world history, the Battle of Plassey. With just a few thousand troops, equipped with modern artillery and firearms, Clive defeated the far larger army of the Nawab of Bengal. It was not simply a battlefield victory. It was the beginning of corporate rule. Bengal was one of the richest regions in the world. By seizing it, the company gained access to immense wealth, agricultural revenue, trade networks, and millions of new subjects. The company no longer relied solely on trade. It now governed territory, collected taxes, and wielded political authority. Over the next decades, the East India Company continued its expansion. But India was far from unified. Several powerful states dominated the subcontinent. The remnants of the Mughal Empire in the north, the Maratha Confederacy in the center, and the Sultanate of Mysore in the south. Meanwhile, France sought influence through its own posts like Pondicherry. The global 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, proved decisive. Britain emerged victorious, weakening French ambitions in India. The East India Company now had a clear path to expand its territory. But this expansion was not peaceful. A series of brutal wars with Mysore and the Marathas followed, stretching from the 1760s to the early 1800s. To sustain this constant conflict, the company massively increased its recruitment of sepoys. By 1800, the company commanded more than 200,000 soldiers, an army larger than that of many European states. With this vast force, the company captured Delhi in 1803, symbolically ending the Mughal Empire's power. By the early 19th century, the East India Company controlled nearly all of what is today India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh.
By the early 19th century, the East India Company had transformed from a merchant enterprise into a territorial giant, an empire built not by kings, but by shareholders. Yet the company's ambitions reached far beyond India. Its interests stretched across Southeast Asia, the Arabian Sea, and eventually into China and Japan. And in these regions, the company discovered a new source of immense profit: opium. China, under the Qing dynasty, had long restricted contact with Europeans. Only a few ports, like Canton, were open to foreign trade. But Chinese demand for British goods was low. Silver, however, flowed heavily from Britain into China in exchange for tea, silk, and porcelain. It was an economic imbalance the British found intolerable. The East India Company's solution was brutal. Flood China with Indian-grown opium, make millions of Chinese people dependent on it, and use the profits to balance Britain's losses. As opium addiction spread across China, the Qing government desperately tried to stop it. Officials seized opium shipments and passed harsh laws against the trade. But the company and the British government refused to retreat. In 1839, Britain went to war against China in what became known as the First Opium War. The conflict ended in 1842 with a resounding British victory. China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking, surrender Hong Kong Island, and open multiple ports to foreign merchants. For the East India Company, this meant access to enormous new markets, further enriching its investors. But while the company's commercial power expanded globally, trouble was growing within India itself. Decades of aggressive taxation, cultural insensitivity, military recruitment policies, and political interference had built up resentment among millions of Indians, princes, peasants, and even sepoys serving in the company's army. The breaking point came in 1857. What began as a military mutiny in the city of Meerut quickly ignited a widespread rebellion across northern India. Sepoys turned against their British officers. Local rulers who had lost land under company rule rallied their people. Civilians rose in anger against decades of exploitation. The rebels seized Delhi and declared their loyalty to the last Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar. The uprising, known in Britain as the Indian Mutiny and in India as the First War of Independence, was the greatest challenge the East India Company had ever faced. Entire regions slipped out of company control. Communication lines were cut. British civilians were killed, and for the first time in a century, the company's rule looked like it might collapse entirely. The uprising lasted more than a year and was brutally violent on both sides. British reprisals were severe, with entire towns destroyed, suspected rebels executed, and repressive laws imposed. By the time the conflict ended, over 6,000 British civilians and company employees were dead. Far more devastating was the toll on India. An estimated 800,000 Indians died from violence, starvation, and disease in the wake of the war. The uprising exposed the company's deepest flaws: its poor governance, corrupt administration, military overreach, and inability to understand or respect the people it ruled. It became clear to the British government that the East India Company was no longer fit to govern a subcontinent. So in August 1858, the British Parliament took decisive action. Through the Government of India Act, all territories controlled by the company were transferred directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria became the symbolic ruler of India, and the British Raj was born. The East India Company, the corporation that conquered and ruled one of the richest regions on earth, was stripped of power. But the company did not disappear instantly. An earlier agreement from 1833 required that shareholders receive a 10.5% annual dividend for 40 years. As a result, the company technically remained in existence, though only as a shell of its former self. It continued operating small functions such as tea trade management, but its era of empire building was over. Finally, in 1873, the British Parliament passed the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act. The last payments were made to shareholders. The East India Company, once the world's most powerful corporation, was formally dissolved. But the legacy of the company lived on long after its legal end. For another 70 years, India remained under British rule. Its economic systems, railways, administrative structure, and army all carried the imprint of the company that had built them. The company's actions reshaped global politics, influenced capitalism, transformed trade routes, and altered the course of Asian history. and its rise poses a question that remains relevant even today. How powerful should a corporation be allowed to become? The East India Company began as a group of merchants seeking profit. It ended as a cautionary tale, a corporation that grew so vast, so wealthy, and so militarized that it became indistinguishable from a state. It controlled territory, collected taxes, waged wars, made alliances, printed currency, and dictated the lives of millions. In many ways, it became too big not to fail. And when it finally did, the shockwaves transformed the British Empire and reshaped the modern world. Today, modern corporations command global resources, influence governments, and shape economies, but none have yet matched the extraordinary power once held by the East India Company, a company that proved how thin the line can be between commerce and conquest.